What would you like to see change in your life? And what is the biggest obstacle that you're facing now? I run 2 programs called Inner Knowing and Good Life Designed for serious individuals who are ready to take the next step in their personal and professional lives. I will personally be coaching a small group of individuals on tools and frameworks for creating an intuitive practice and for creating self-mastery in their life. As someone who's helped countless entrepreneurs open doors of possibility that they never thought existed, I've seen these strategies transform people's lives. The best part is that you'll 10x your output, unlock your creative genius. I'll work with you weekly to overcome your limiting beliefs. I'll teach you how to create clarity, processes, develop your intuition, and set a new framework on how to live your best life. And you'll get access to guided meditations that I have personally created that are not available anywhere else. We'll create a new self-concept that you can practice moving forward. This method is so effective that even if you don't have a lot of time or if you think you're not ready for a change, these frameworks and methodologies will still work for you. You can check out the link in the show notes to join the waiting list, and you can also check out what some of the previous clients had to say about our time together. It's first come, first serve, and I hope to see you there. Hi, my name is Yasmin Tarehi, and this is Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and spirituality. Today's guest is William Keepin, PhD, who is the co-founder of the Gender Equity and Reconciliation International Project. He's a mathematical physicist who's widely published in the fields of sustainable energy, global warming, archetypal cosmology, comparative mysticism, and the intersection of science and spirituality. Will has presented testimony to European and Australian parliaments and the U.S. House of Representatives. He also became a whistleblower in nuclear science policy, recounted in the Cultural Creatives book. Will co-founded the Satyana Institute, together with Reverend Cynthia Brix, organized 5 international conferences to facilitate dialogue, interspiritual practice, and collaboration across the major religions and science. He's also trained extensively in spiritual traditions, East and West. He holds a PhD in applied mathematics, an MS in mathematical physics, an MA in East-West psychology, and an honorary doctorate from the California Institute of Integral Studies. He's a fellow at the Feinhorn Foundation. I can just go on and on about Will. He's also authored a number of books.
That's enough.
I'll include the rest of it in the show notes about your bio because you've done so much and it's so wonderful. But I want to just highlight some of the books that we're going to be talking about today. One in particular is Gender Equity and Reconciliation, 30 Years of Healing the Most Ancient Wound in the Human Family. So welcome to the show, Will. So happy to have you here. And just to give folks context, we met a few weeks ago at a conference in Sedona, and I was just so taken aback by Will's thoughtfulness when it came to the conversation around science and spirituality. So welcome to the show.
Thank you so much, Yasmin. Yes, it was a joy to meet you, and it's a joy to be here on this podcast today.
Oh, so Will, to kick it off, you're a mathematical physicist, and can you tell us, what are some of the maybe invisible patterns and principles that kind of organize what we observe and experience in our physical world?
Well, my understanding is that there are various levels of hidden realities that are not immediately perceptible to our 5 physical senses and to our minds that basically underlie and orchestrate all of existence and basically determine what we perceive. This understanding goes by different names in different traditions and different kind of scientific systems. But one particular articulation that I have found particularly useful is the one that was given by physicist David Boehm. David Boehm was a close colleague of Albert Einstein's, and he grappled with the deeper implications of the revolution in physics that took place in the 20th century, particularly quantum physics and also relativity theory. And to make a long story short, he basically came up with the notion of what he called the implicate and the explicate order. The explicate order essentially refers to the physical universe as we perceive it. That includes what we perceive through our five senses and through our mind. And then the other, what he called the implicate order, is essentially an underlying reality that we don't directly perceive through our senses or through our thoughts, but which actually orchestrates all experience and is underlying all of reality. So he saw it, the nature of existence as having these two qualities. The essence of existence, as he put it, is that it is an undivided wholeness in flowing movement, in a particular structure such that each part of the flow contains the entire flow. I can say more about that later. But the bottom line is that there is this invisible patterns and order taking place that is responsible and orchestrates the visible patterns that we see and experience.
So I want to dig into that because I think for people listening, they might be really interested and perhaps curious about ways that this implicate kind of this underlying order that we're not using, with our five senses, that has so much power in our day-to-day life and in our day-to-day reality. What maybe practical examples could you give about this implicate and explicate order? Can you give us a practical example of how someone would maybe use both of these principles within their day-to-day life?
Sure. In our day-to-day life, part of what we experience is the flow of sensation and the flow of thought. And in a certain sense, our entire experience in our conscious experience of life is a series of thoughts and sense impressions. And if we develop, let's say, certain spiritual practice, whether it's meditation, deep silent meditation, or a contemplative practice such as prayer, or whatever it might be, there is a kind of gateway through which we pass, a portal through which we pass to a realm that's beyond thought and that is beyond direct perception, but that dwells within as a kind of presence. We all know this, we all experience this, but the minute we speak of it, sometimes it starts to sound woo-woo or kind of otherworldly, when in fact it is the kind of silent substrate out of which all experience emerges. There's a teaching from one of the masters who was asked, what does it mean to meditate? How do you meditate? And the master said, have you ever noticed that between one thought and the next, there's a little gap? And the student said, yes. And the master said, prolong the gap. So the idea is that between our ordered moments of experience moving from one experience to the next, there actually are, if we attend very deeply, this kind of silent spaciousness underlying it all. And that deep silence is the gateway into the underlying reality of all phenomena. So there is this experience that across all of the spiritual traditions and mystical traditions that the mystics attest to, of this silent, they use the term eternal, meaning that it's beyond time. Eternal doesn't just mean, lasting forever, but it means it's outside of time and space. And there is this presence to which we all have access, which basically underlies all of experience. and is a place of profound and deep refuge if we can develop a relationship to it.
Yeah, it's such a powerful point. And I think there are people in our audience who have experienced that gap for prolonged periods of time, and then others, I think, who are maybe approaching this viewpoint from a very logical and analytical mindset and haven't experienced that. And I think that's really where I see a lot of the divide happening. Folks who've maybe experienced that gateway and others who maybe are so busy. I think that's true for so many people right now, right? We're being socially programmed and just so busy all the time that we don't even have space to even listen to these conversations, frankly. What would you say to someone who is very resistant to this type of this viewpoint?
I would say that basically anyone who has ever felt a flash of love in the heart, where something is so beautiful that we use the phrase, it takes your breath away. And in that moment, even if you don't experience it daily now, I think almost everyone can find in their past experience a moment when some beautiful scene, either it was an experience with another person, or it was an experience with nature, or a moment when you suddenly opened to the beauty of an animal or a flower or something, where there's a kind of interruption of the flow of time. It takes your breath away and you move into a moment of silent awe. And that moment of silent awe is a portal into this realm that we're speaking of. It's a moment where experience seems to stop. Time almost seems to stop. And we are in a kind of reverent communion with something that has deeply touched our heart.
Hmm.
And I would say that's something that I think really most people can relate to. It's that feeling when you see a young infant that's, 2 months old or 3 months old, and they suddenly make eye contact with you, and that infant bursts into a smile. And you see there's nothing but pure being there. And hardly anyone can do anything other than smile back. It calls you into that moment of communion, of union with something that is eternal, something that is pre-conscious. I mean, that little infant doesn't understand who you are, doesn't understand what it means to be a human being, doesn't even know that it has a body that's separate from yours yet. It's just lighting up with the miracle of beingness and meeting you in that moment. That kind of moment is what I'm speaking of, that takes you into this quality of what Boehm called the implicate order, but what, spiritual mystics would give many different names to. So there's lots of names for it across the traditions, but it actually is an experience that is accessible to each one of us.
Hmm. Thank you for that example. Yeah, you just transported me. It's so wild how there are certain ways that we can use words to move us into different states of being. And yeah, I really appreciate also the example of an infant. And there is no transactional quality to the relationship, right? Because they, like you said, they don't actually even know that you're there, really. So that's beautiful. And I want to dig a little bit into the work of David Boehm. You studied his work for a very long time, and I would love to understand, what really attracted you to David Boehm's work, and what are some of the kind of major conclusions that you've made from his work, and perhaps where him and Einstein diverged.
Thank you. I love speaking about David Boehm because he, to me, exemplifies the true nature of a scientist. A scientist is someone who is deeply committed to the quest for truth. And Boehm understood science as a quest for truth. And I was first attracted to him when I learned about the implicate order and the explicate order, which he articulated in a book called Wholeness in the Implicate Order. But then I learned about his history. And what I so love about David Boehm is that he had such a deep passion for what is the ultimate nature of reality. What is this universe that we find ourselves in? And what is our true nature? And Boehm carried his quest deeply into physics, particularly into quantum physics. And actually, I'm going to interrupt myself there because I'll say that Boehm was troubled by the fact that the twin pillars of the major revolution of physics that took place in the 20th century, namely quantum physics and relativity theory, are actually contradictory at their foundations. And Boehm was troubled by the fact that this contradiction was there. And he was also troubled by the fact that most physicists seem not to be worried about that contradiction. So here you had these two breakthrough theories, but they don't agree with each other because relativity theory says that reality should be local and continuous, and quantum theory says that reality is non-local and discontinuous. And so they actually contradict each other in quite profound ways. And yet most physicists seem to gloss over that. So that was the starting point for Boehm, was to try to unify and how do these things fit together? And what he came up with was, after many years of research, he came up with the realization that there's more going on than meets the eyes of our physical eyes and meets the apertures of our scientific experiments in the laboratory. And one way that Boehm put it, which is very beautiful, I think, very deep insight, he said, a hidden order may be present in what appears to be random. So science, when it looks at patterns that it can't understand and it sees no particular pattern there, it sees random behavior, science traditionally will project onto that random behavior the assumption that there's no order, there's no underlying principle there. And what Boehm was saying was, very possibly there is, and it's something that we haven't yet discerned. And so underlying what appears to be random may be a hidden order. And he gave lots of different examples of this. One example I'll just mention, which is very illustrative. He took, if you take a glass of glycerin, a cylinder of glycerin, and then you put another cylinder inside it. So you have glycerin as a thick, transparent liquid. Then if you place an inklet, a droplet of ink on the top surface of that glycerin, and then you turn the inner cylinder, the outer cylinder is stationary. So this glycerin is slowly getting mixed up by the turning of the inner cylinder. And what happens is that ink droplet stretches out and becomes thinner and fainter, and eventually it disappears completely. Now, at that point, it's tempting to conclude that the order that was present in the ink drop has now been rendered chaotic. It's kind of distributed equally throughout the glycerin. But it turns out, if you now turn that inner cylinder in the opposite direction, what'll happen is you keep turning it, is this ink structure begins to reappear. And as you keep turning, it gets shorter and thicker. And finally, the entire ink droplet reconstructs itself. And what Boehm said is that this shows the nature of the implicate and the explicate order. Because when that ink droplet had disappeared, its order was no longer visible. It seemed like there was no order left. It seemed like it was dispersed throughout the glycerin the same way that your cream is dispersed throughout your tea when you stir it. But in fact, because when you turn that cylinder the opposite direction, the whole ink droplet reconstructs itself, that means the order in that droplet was still existing even when it was totally invisible. And that's what he meant by the implicate order. And what he said is that all of reality works that way. All of existence first appears as an invisible pattern in the implicate order. It's kind of like a design principle. It's almost like the blueprint before you build the building. And that exists in a realm beyond our physical senses and our thoughts. And then what happens is, in a sense, that crank turns, and that purely implicate pattern of energy takes form and manifests as a particle, as an event, as a person. All of the things that we see and perceive in the universe were originally in this form of an invisible order, which now takes manifestation in a visible form. And because of that, he said there's a very profound relationship between the visible and this larger implicate order, which he called it the implicate order, which is the non-manifest realm. And with that understanding, he was able to develop a whole new understanding of quantum physics that explains all of the bizarre phenomena of quantum physics within a model of physics that looks at the explicate order as the manifest reality that we experience in the laboratory, and the implicate order as the hidden invisible dimensions of that are not yet visible, but become visible as time flows on.
So fascinating. I'm just like, wow, so many follow-up questions to that. I mean, so this question sort of begs me to question whether, how much agency then do we have to shift this invisible world? If, let's say, I guess what you're saying, and correct me if I'm wrong here, is that there's all these patterns, there's these invisible patterns that exist that we can't really see them, right? But they exist, right? And whatever we're putting our awareness or attention on is going to manifest. It's not so much that we have to change it, is that all these things exist, but we are just tuning to the place that we want to project into the external reality. Is that kind of what you mean by that? I'm just trying to translate this into how people can maybe shift their own day-to-day life with this concept.
Yeah, so that's really good. It's a very important question. And I know that it's quite theoretical what I'm speaking about, but it has a very deep practical application. And to get to that, I want to speak to one other piece that David Boehm brought in, which is really essential. Well, first of all, let me just give a little history here because it's so fascinating. When Einstein encountered quantum physics, he basically objected because he said, this theory implies that there's a fundamental entanglement between every particle in the universe and every other particle. And to illustrate this, he developed what was called the EPR paradox, which refers to the three people who thought of it: Einstein, Podolsky, and Rosen. And basically what they showed was that if you have two entangled particles and you move them very, very far apart, if you make a measurement on one, the other one automatically knows what measurement that was. And that Einstein thought was so ridiculously absurd that he dismissed it as what he called spooky action at a distance. And he said that can't be, and therefore quantum physics is an incomplete theory, meaning it's basically wrong. Or as it stands, it's still wrong. Boehm, however, took a different approach. And he and Einstein, by the way, were close colleagues, and they agreed on many things. And Einstein famously said once that if anyone can reformulate a theory of quantum physics, it will be David Boehm, which I think is a very remarkable prophetic statement because in 1952, David Boehm did just that. He published a paper in which he reformulated the entire understanding of quantum physics up to that point. And he did it based on this principle that's called non-locality. And non-locality simply means, basically, in essence, that everything is intimately interconnected with everything else at a level that is beyond space and time. That is what Einstein found unacceptable. And so did most physicists. I mean, this was a very bizarre phenomenon. But quantum physics was implying this. The data were suggesting this is how it works. So David Boehm said, let me try a theory that assumes this at the foundation. So Boehm created a theory of quantum physics with non-locality built in at the foundation. And then just to give this history, he published that in 1952. Shortly after that, a physicist named John Bell read Boehm's papers, and as he put it, I saw the impossible done, because it was assumed that this couldn't be done, that such a theory could not exist. And now Boehm had proved that wrong by producing such a theory. John Bell, who's famous for what's called the Bell's theorem, spent 12 years trying to get rid of that non-locality. He basically went into the depths of Boehm's model, which he found brilliant, but he thought, well, if I can just get rid of this non-locality, then it'll be a really good, solid theory. And also, Einstein would like it, because Einstein didn't like the non-locality either. Well, what Bell found is that trying to get rid of non-locality actually led him down a pathway that forced him to realize it can't be gotten rid of. And so in 1964, John Bell published his famous paper in which he basically, based on this model from Boehm, developed what he calls Bell's theorem, which gave an experimental criterion by which this could be tested, this non-locality could be tested in the laboratory, in principle. What then happened in 1972, and then again in 1982, and then again in the 2000s to 2018 or so, a whole series of experimentalists came along and started testing this principle. The first one was John Clauser in 1972, then the French physicist Alain Aspect in 1982, and that's when I first found out about this. He developed an experiment showing that if you have two photons, no matter how far apart they are, if you measure one, suddenly the other one's angular momentum is suddenly determined. This was a very remarkable finding because it suggested that these things were fundamentally intertangled instantaneously. In other words, there's an interconnection that's beyond space and time. And that was foundational to the whole principle of non-locality. And what happened over the next 15 or 20 years was a whole series of experiments to plug all the possible loopholes to see, oh, this couldn't possibly be correct, or maybe this little flaw in the experiment is why it's coming out this way and it's not really correct. So they plugged all these different loopholes all the way until about 2017 with the experiments of Anton Zeilinger. And finally, last October, these set of physicists that I just mentioned, John Clauser, Alain Aspect, and Anton Zeilinger, received the Nobel Prize in Physics, which basically validated the fact that non-locality is real. It is foundational to quantum physics and to the nature of reality. That Einstein, on this one note, bless his heart, was mistaken. This so-called spooky action at a distance is real. And in fact, it is the very foundation of what's called the second quantum revolution, which is revolutionizing right now computers and information exchange. So all of this unfolded out of Boehm's first paper in 1952, which then led Bell to produce Bell's theorem in 1964, which then basically eventually led to this recent Nobel Prize. Now, what I find so inspiring about all of this is that what all of that whole series of theory and experiment are showing is that the nature of reality is fundamentally non-local. Every part of reality is intrinsically and inherently connected to every other part. And this is what Boehm meant when he said the hollow movement is an undivided wholeness in flowing movement in which each part of the flow contains the entire flow. So the hollow movement has what he called a holographic structure. And a hologram, as you know, it's like a fractal. It's a structure. It's a nested set of self-similar structures. It's a little bit like imagining the whole cosmos as a set of Russian dolls. You know how Russian dolls, you open the one and you get inside, you get a littler one, you open that and you get a littler one inside. And if you keep going, you get a tiny little one. And if it's a good set, then that tiny little one has all the same structure and markings as the original. And what Boehm said is that the nature of all of reality has this structure, this holographic structure, or what he called the holo movement. It's like a set of Russian dolls constantly morphing, in which each part of the universe contains all the rest of the universe in a microcosmic replication. I'll stop there for the moment.
Yeah, I'm just so, just soaking it all in. I think this concept of non-local consciousness is so important to discuss because it feels like that's really where people are divided on reality, right? It's like if you believe in a local consciousness versus non-local consciousness, because I think that this is such an important concept to understand when it comes to the intersection of science and spirituality. And I will say anecdotally, I kind of didn't believe in a lot of this stuff until I experienced about 7 years ago my own clairaudient experience where I tapped into non-local consciousness. I was able to gather information about something in a different time space than what I was in at that moment. And it happened over and over again. And
Beautiful.
Yeah. And found out there was a term for it called clairaudience. And I think after that, the series of clairaudient events started to happen. I was like, there's no way that this is chance or luck or coincidence. I mean, it was just massively unexplainable in a local consciousness universe, if you will. And so that's what really opened my mind to that. And so, but I really want to understand, why is the non-local piece so important to understand? And then separately, I can ask this right after, but just to make sure we talk about it, is what causes certain, I guess, people, energy, particles, whatever you want to call it, what causes certain energies to be more entangled with other energies than anything else? So, for example, why would I be more entangled with certain energy patterns or structures than others, right? Because we are entangled with the rest of the universe. Everything is interconnected. But what is and maybe, I don't know if you can even answer this, but what causes one particle to become more entangled with another?
Well, first of all, I just love the questions. I love the inquiry, and I certainly can't answer these questions. I can offer some reflections. Let me first say that clairaudience and clairvoyance and clairsentience are all forms of perception that are working with and through the implicate order. The explicate order is our normal way of receiving and transmitting communication signals and understanding knowledge and perception. But there is this capacity in all of us to dip into the implicate order and begin to perceive through this other sixth sense, if you will. It is really our spiritual epistemology. And let me say how it works first. This is in a general theoretical sense. But let me give you a simple recipe, which the Dalai Lama outlined very beautifully in a talk that I heard once. I think it really speaks to this. The Dalai Lama said, if you want to know the deepest secrets of the universe, there are 4 steps. First, explore the outer visible universe, essentially, the physical aspects of life and the tangible aspects of the universe that we find ourselves in. Second, explore the invisible inner universe, the intangibles, the feelings, the perceptions within. Third, study the relationship between the two. It's really key, that third step. And then fourth, he said, from these 3, you can come to know the deepest secrets of the universe. Now, going back to Boehm for a moment, when Boehm proposed what he calls the holo movement, which is really his theoretical model of all of existence, the structure of that is that each part of the universe has access to information about the entire universe. And that Russian doll idea is one way to image it. Another way that I think gives quite an elegant image is to bring in the image of what's called Indra's net from the ancient Buddhist and Hindu cosmologies. And in Indra's net, it's a very simple image. It's you imagine a whole beautiful array of jewels, these glistening jewels extending to infinity. And the, each one is very shiny surface. And so if you look in the facets of just one of those jewels, you see all the others reflected there. So there's a way in which each jewel somehow reflects or contains in its facets reflections of all the others. Now, if you take that image of that kind of lattice of jewels and you now add spatial variation and temporal variation. Spatial variation means you make some of the jewels bigger than others. So some of them are very tiny and some of them are gigantic in size. And temporal variation means you get them all whirling around. So these jewels are all swirling around in some grand cosmic swirling universe of jewels. Now, if you look in the facets of any one jewel, even a little tiny one, you'll see that whole swirling universe of jewels precisely replicated in that tiny little jewel. So the whole cosmos of moving jewels is somehow contained and replicated in the tiny little jewel that you're looking at. That is a very kind of clear metaphor for how the holo movement works. It's holographically structured such that each human being contains within themselves this entire cosmos on a microscopic scale. And what's so beautiful about this is it's completely consistent with what the mystics down through the ages have said. So the mystics, for example, the Chandogya Upanishad talks about in the depths of the heart, there is a secret dwelling. And in that dwelling is the lotus of the heart. And in that secret place, the entire universe is contained. The sun and the stars and the galaxies are all there. And this space knows no age, knows no dying. It is beyond time. So this, and then it sort of encourages you to seek that space, seek that depth in the lotus of the heart. This whole principle that if we go deeply enough into our own being, the very foundation of who we are as human beings, we go through that portal, we discover that gateway to the infinite in the depths of our own self. The way that the great mystic Rumi put it, he says, you are not just a drop from the infinite ocean. You are the infinite ocean contained in a single drop. So that's the same idea as this Indra's net. Now, if you apply all of that, this has a very definite application, because what this means is that if you learn how to go deep within yourself, you go beyond the normal explicate order ways of perceiving, and you begin to connect directly to the implicate order of perception, and you begin to make your own direct connection to the rest of the cosmos. Now, how that will come depends on your particular orientation. It's not that you will be flooded with the entire universe all manifesting itself at once, but you will begin to have these insights, these perceptions that you were speaking of with the clairaudience, the clairvoyance. And clairsentience is really feeling those energies. And actually, that's one set of a whole realm of what are often called paranormal capacities and abilities, which we all have, but they're not well developed in many of us. But these are the perceptions of the implicate order. They are what the Dalai Lama was referring to in that third step when he said, you must understand and explore the relationship between the outer physical, visible universe and the inner invisible cosmos. And the relationship between the two actually gives you the capacity to perceive directly from within the depths of your own being the deepest secrets of the nature of reality. And I personally will add to this that I think Bohm and Einstein and all of the great physicists and scientists are working with this realm. These ideas that they have, and they come up with these grand ideas, actually come from that implicate order, and then they manifest in thought forms that then become testable in the laboratory. But the insights themselves come out of the blue, so to speak. They come as a sort of light bulb that goes off because they're actually coming from the implicate order, if you will.
Wow. I love this theory about non-local consciousness and the explanation of, I guess, this holotropic universe, right? That we're living in, that we're all
right.
connected to this one thing, and it's but what so many of the mystics have been saying for so long, and so it really feels so in alignment with our like kind of sacred indigenous wisdom that we're interconnected, that all of us shares the same spark from the universe, right? And we see ourselves as separate, but we actually do have this one universal mind. And I think it's been called so many different things. Freud, I think, called it the field, or there's been so many names for this same thing, which is where we can tap into this, this higher power.
Exactly.
I think, it's been so fascinating because I think that I encounter people who are resistant to this type of conversation because in our social construct, we are still very much ingrained in a zero-sum game, win-lose universe. And if we have that theory of reality, then we look for confirmation to support that theory, right? So,
right.
Yeah. So it's just.
No, it's really beautiful what you're saying. And, it's summed up so beautifully by, for example, that beautiful saying from William Blake, where he speaks of seeing the entire universe contained in a grain of sand and eternity in an hour. He's speaking to that perception of moving into the holographic perception of reality, which we have access to, in which it's true. That tiny grain of sand does contain the whole universe because it's like one of those jewels in Indra's net. And 1 hour does contain eternity because one can, within the space of an hour, enter into the timeless, enter into that space that's beyond time. It takes practice and it takes sort of consciousness skills, but these are available ultimately to everyone. And whether you're religious or not, like you said, it's there in the indigenous traditions, it's there in the Taoist and the non-theistic traditions, as well as in the Abrahamic religions. I mean, Meister Eckhart, the great Christian mystic, who said that when the heart is prepared, the heart of the devotee is prepared, he's speaking in God language, of course, he says, then God pours all of his infinity, all of his divinity, all of his beauty into that heart and holds nothing back. So he's speaking about this same experience where the purified heart has access to the entire cosmos coming through.
Wow, beautiful. I love that. So we could talk probably for another couple hours about David Boehm and quantum physics and the holotropic universe, but I actually want to switch gears and talk about a really important part of your life's work, which is your gender equity and reconciliation work. And specifically, Desmond Tutu actually endorsed your organization. I mean, that's huge. So I'd love to know, like, maybe you could describe for our audience, what is the Gender Equity and Reconciliation Institute? I believe that's the name of it. And why did you and your co-founder, Cynthia, decide to create this?
Well, I kind of stumbled into this unexpectedly because I was working in this arena of science and then environmental science. I worked in that arena of climate change and strategies for abating global warming through sustainable energy. And in the course of that, there was, let's just say, Me Too types of violations taking place within our professional networks. So that's how this actually got started back in the late 80s and early 90s. And this was creating, as happens, a lot of pain. We all know the pattern now of certain dynamics, certain kinds of exploitation that are hidden, that can't be spoken about, that are taboo. And so a group of us back in the early 90s decided to address this within our professional networks. That's how this program got started. And I never intended that it would go beyond, our own internal set of colleagues. And so, but that's how this work started. And the first couple of events that we organized to address this problem within our professional networks kind of blew up in our face, if you will, the power of what was released, that we gave voice, we gave permission for this to be spoken, unleashed incredible power and pain. And we realized, my gosh, this is something powerful is happening here. Some of the facilitators said, we're going to put the lid back on Pandora's box and close it up because we have an earth to save. And the others of us were saying, no, actually, this is part of that work. And so we began experimenting basically with whatever we could try that might help us skillfully navigate this territory. We quickly found out that just trying to talk through the issues was not enough. We needed deeper experiential modalities to work with these powerful energies. Basically, what we were doing was giving a forum for unspoken truths to be told that needed to be told. And that by being kept hidden, we're also keeping in place a whole oppressive system and exploitive system. And of course, it didn't entail everyone. It's not like everyone was engaged in this exploitation, but there was enough of it going on that it was creating a pattern and a psychological toxicity within the human ecology of this movement of people who were trying to solve the Earth's ecology. So what happened then over the next 2 or 3 years as we began to experiment with these, we convened a couple of events a year, again, restricted only to networks of colleagues. After a couple of years, we began to get traction with this and some successful ways of working with it and some powerful results of healing and liberation and a sense of people being able to shed these patterns and speak truth to it and liberate themselves from it. And that was about the time that Desmond Tutu in South Africa was doing the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, developed those principles. And we were so inspired by what he was doing. And I was thinking, this is exactly what we're doing, except, of course, on a much smaller scale. But it's the same process, and that we need a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, not only around racial healing, but also around gender healing. And so we actually renamed our work Gender Reconciliation as we followed Desmond Tutu's work closely, never imagining for a moment that we'd ever go to South Africa, much less meet him. But what happened was that by the mid to late 90s, we started getting invitations outside of the environmental movement because people started hearing about what we were doing. And so although we had never intended to do it beyond our own professional networks, we started getting these invitations, particularly from certain academics, progressive academics, and then psychotherapists who were interested in our work, and certain religious and clergy who were interested in our work. So as these invitations started coming in, we began to offer these programs in wider venues. And it just kind of grew steadily and slowly from there. We maintained a policy for a long time of only going where we were invited. We never marketed the work. It was a very kind of deep and sort of volatile work. We were still developing it, so we weren't trying to promote it or market it, but we were responding to these invitations. And so that's how the work grew. And in the late 90s and into the early 2000s, in 2001, we got invited to India. In 2003, we got invited to South Africa. And that really took the work in a whole new direction, working in these cultures of really extreme gender-based violence, and finding this methodology working even in those contexts. And then in 2006, we got invited to do an event for members of parliament in South Africa And that was a watershed event that led to invitations all around the country. And we kept following the thread of this work, and that's what we've been doing ever since. And now we are a global training organization. We've introduced the work to about 14,000 people in a dozen countries, and we're training facilitators around the world in this work. And as far as Desmond Tutu, what happened was we met him in 2012 through some colleagues who knew him and thought he would be inspired by this work. And so we had a series of meetings with him, and indeed he became enthused and very supportive of what we were doing. And then they proposed a partnership with his foundation, the Desmond and Leah Tutu Legacy Foundation, to implement this work in universities. And that has then continued to evolve through twists and turns. And so we now have this program going in several South African universities. And also his daughter, who is also engaged in this kind of work, ended up writing the foreword to our new book that was published last October.
Amazing.
So it's been a long and rich journey.
Wow.
Yeah.
Amazing, amazing. And the book is rich with, so many wonderful stories, and talks a lot about your program, about even just things like, how sexuality is, there's the role sexuality plays in gender reconciliation, and how men and women can take action. We are unfortunately coming at time, Will, so I apologize. But for folks,
no problem.
Okay, because for folks who want to learn more about this work, they can check out your latest book, which is called also Gender Equity and Reconciliation, which we'll include it in the show notes as well. But I want to wrap this up and kind of understand, like, looking back on your journey, you've done so many different things, and you've spent a lot of time kind of at the intersection of science and spirituality and gender reconciliation and archetypal cosmology and more. What sort of things, like looking back, have surprised you the most?
A couple of things. First of all, I'm often asked, how did you go from this, to environmental science, to how did this thread unfold? And for me, it has been a quest for truth all along. I was so inspired as a young college student by the quest for truth in science and mathematics. And that quest for truth also led me into the environmental work that I did, and really into love itself as the deepest truth, that the truth of compassion and love as something that inspired me. And that kind of led me also into the gender equity and reconciliation work. Is what is the essence of what's going on in the soul-to-soul connections here, in the violations of those connections, and in the healing of those connections. And that also is what led me into the work with bringing the mystics together from across the traditions. Because if the deepest truth is love, the deepest form of love is divine love, and the spiritual love in the depths of the heart for the spiritual dimension of existence. And so to me, it's been a consistent thread of following that thread of truth to love, to divine love. If I look in terms of what have been some of the biggest surprises, I think one has been the beautiful awakening that came through physics and science that then sort of opened naturally into spirituality. The work of David Boehm in particular led me also into exploring Krishnamurti deeply, because Boehm had extensive dialogues with spiritual masters such as Krishnamurti and the Dalai Lama. And that really helped me as a scientist to go beyond the confines of physics and also enter into deep spiritual exploration. And that was a major surprise, because I began to see foundational patterns that are consistent between the scientific worldview and the spiritual worldview, even though those are usually seen as distinct and in somewhat contradictory and in some tension with each other. To me, they're part of an integral, harmonious whole. And the other thing I'll say is that in terms of the gender equity and reconciliation work, what I think has surprised me the most is the power of truth telling. There's a saying that, the truth shall set you free. And I would add that deeper truths shall set you more deeply free. And I am convinced of the power of the human spirit is greater than any of these shackles that we put on ourselves, including long-standing oppressions such as racism and gender oppression, which are, thousands of years old. Yet time and again, I feel like I have been privileged to witness the transformative power of the human heart to heal these things, to cross these unbridgeable gulfs, and for the shackles that seem so strong to just crumble before the twin powers of truth and love. And so I feel like I've seen that consistently across the 30 years, and it's what keeps me going.
Oh, that's so beautiful. Well, thank you so much for sharing that. It's really moving. I mean, the power of truth telling as kind of a vehicle that is transformational, and love, right? This divine. I love that you made a distinction between love and then divine love too, because I do feel that they're different. The human.
They are very different.
Right.
Yeah, they're quite different.
Yeah.
As my spiritual teacher hammered that into me, because she said, you're trying to make a human love out of what is a transcendent love. And it's a very important distinction.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Will, thank you so much for your time. Where can people find you, find resources about your books, your work, or even participate in some of the gender equity reconciliation programs? What's the best way to get in touch?
Probably the best way is through our websites. For the gender equity and reconciliation work, it's www.grworld.org. GR standing for gender reconciliation. And for the interspiritual work, it's www.dawnofinterspirituality.org. And then I also have a personal website, which I'm developing, which is williamkeepin.com. And also our organizational website which is satyana.org, satyana.org. But probably the main websites would be the GR World and the Dawn of Interspirituality.
Amazing. Okay, wonderful. We'll include that in the show notes as well. Thank you so much again for your time. And for our audience, thanks for joining and for listening. In this episode, we learned about quantum physics and gender equity and reconciliation with William Keepin. And you can tune in to Gateways to Awakening, where we host one-on-one conversations with leading experts in wellness, well-being, and spirituality. Thanks again.